have to admit, when this assignment came through our seminary in Bend this summer, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to respond to it. I certainly know of St. Catherine of Siena, our patronal saint here in Du Bois, and I had studied a bit about her when I was taking church history classes, but I really didn't know much about her as a person. To be able to say, yes, she's giving a message that applies to me in my life. She has important information on how I can be a better Christian, on how people in general can live a better life. None of that really came to mind when I was recalling what I knew about this woman. So it was surprising to me, as I read more about Catherine, to find out how extremely applicable her teachings are to me as a woman in the church, as well as to all of us who are living in a society that is full of chaos, very much like what Catherine experienced in her own life. One of the things that came across to me immediately as I was reading about Catherine was that she had a lot of personal freedoms that were infringed upon because of the time in which she was living, the fact that she was a woman who was very much in tune with the church and trying to help the church move forward, and also because she lived through a pandemic, not once, not twice, but 3 times in her short 33 years, very much like we are experiencing today. So that infringement of personal freedoms, especially those freedoms that we take for granted, was apparent in her life, as I know has been apparent in mine and in probably all of yours. Things like attending sporting events or visiting our friends, especially during times of celebration, dining out, basic face-to-face contact with people, even worshiping together as a faith community, were things that were curtailed in Catherine's time as well as in our time. These days, we face arrows on the floor that tell us where we are supposed to go. We read the signs that tell us that we must wear a mask if we are to enter an establishment. Or even worse, when we hear the signs or hear the words and read the signs, no visitors permitted to enter this establishment for the safety of our patients or our residents. Yes, COVID-19 has brought more than a virus to our lives. It has placed our personal freedoms in bondage. And this is an example of one of the paradoxes that Catherine of Siena experienced as well as taught about, especially in her book, her dialogues. This is freedom in a world of restrictions, a paradox that we all face today. Encouraged by the gospel message and in her strong belief that God wanted her to use her freedom to choose good, as God encourages us to choose good with our free will, Catherine proclaims, and this is a quote, that we elect freedom as our spouse, and this will set us free from the darkness of restrictions. That's a very strong analogy, that we choose freedom as we would choose a spouse. With a spouse, we meld our freedoms with those of the other person, and vice versa. The same is true of anyone who chooses a certain vocation, or anyone who devotes his life or her life to anything or anyone that is important to them. As a mom, I always put the concerns of our children before the concerns of my own. For those of us who are caregivers, the needs of those people who rely on us become our priority. For a person who willfully and knowingly chooses a vocation, they commit their whole life and all of their efforts toward the responsibilities of that vocation and the creed of that vocation. And interestingly enough, we do not change our identities when we make these choices. We no longer live for ourselves, and therefore we are free to move from the restrictions of self-gratification to the needs and the desires of others. And so our world widens. Choosing freedom allows us to stand up to the fear of oppression that is especially prevalent in our times, as well as to consider the needs of others. There are two other precious gifts that Catherine writes about and teaches about when she is talking about freedom. One is the gift of our intellect, and the other is that of free will, with the second one being the one that is stronger for all of us, because it is the one thing that we have that is completely in our control. To see how this came to be, we turn to the book of Genesis and the narratives of creation. Here we read that we are formed in the image and likeness of God, and therefore we become masters of ourselves and free masters of the world. Thus, because of the image in which we were made, we neither fear nor care about anything other than what God wishes, according to Catherine. It couldn't have been any clearer for her, and yet another paradox emerges from this story. Being formed in the image and likeness of God, we do have the gift of free will, and what a gift it is. But wait a minute. How can we say that we have free will if we align our will with that of God's? And therein lies the paradox. Is there really a choice on our part? Or are we puppets on a string to choose what God wants us to choose? And Catherine solves this paradox with this statement. Because of the gift of free will, we are able to choose the way of self-satisfaction, power, pride, and greed. It is all fully within our reach. And we are also free to choose to live God's will through the choices that we make. Those who choose the former will reap the benefits and the pitfalls that accompany that choice, just as those who follow God's will shall also have the rewards and the difficulties associated with living with God's ways. As I said earlier, Catherine experienced the bubonic plague 3 times during her 33 years, and so she was well aware of the loss of freedom to the self-seekers in her world. She witnessed the suffering of the ill among her own family and moved from the security of her cell under the stairs in her family home to treat those who had contracted the plague and to support the caregivers with gentle words and kindness and encouragement. Likewise, she also saw the corruption of the civic and the church leaders who were all around her, trying to fulfill their own interest. Those who defied safety measures so that their coffers would continue to grow. Those who used the authority that they owned to demean other people. Those who used their power to cut down the value of other people. And those who laughed in the face of danger and forced action on those who depended on their generosity for their livelihood. Not ironically, but these descriptions also fit many of the people that we know in our life today as we face the pandemic. So Catherine has given us this wonderful image that we can think about free will and the evil is in our life. She uses the image of a wall that divides the masses into slaves and slave owners. And she reminds her readers and listeners, your will is master of the wall. And with the pickaxe of your free choice, you can maintain or demolish it as you choose. Your will is master of the wall, and with the pickaxe of your free choice, you can maintain or demolish it as you choose. Make no mistake, Catherine was well aware of reality. She may have been an introvert, but she was very much aware of the evil that surrounded her. And she knew that moral evil was unavoidable. She didn't forget, however, that there was an antidote to evil. If we were not free, she says, we would have an excuse for sin. But we have no excuse because there is nothing that can force us to sin against our will. So how did Catherine know all of this? She was just a young woman from a large family that really had very little formal education, but she knew these things quite simply because God had told her. She knew this was the case because from a very early age, she had been in conversation with God, and her faith in God's guidance, coupled with her trust that God would never abandon her, was so strong that she found herself doing and saying things that otherwise would not have been her own actions. Having left the seclusion of that tiny cell in her home, Catherine found God's direction taking her to the streets of the sinners and the saints, the prisoners of illness and poverty, the prostitutes who look for self-survival, and the outcast, the people that no one had anyone to whom to turn. She was always so full of joy when she met these people that she was able to strengthen their own resolve to fight evil through that joy. There was nothing powerful about Catherine by herself, but her willingness to allow the Spirit of God to work through her empowered both her and others. In her youth, she was able to write letters to politicians, to clergy, to nuns, and even to the Pope to remind them that they had work to do and they had better get to it quickly. Prayer, as we learned for Catherine, allowed Catherine to recognize God's voice to her and to find how she could be providence to others. So what does all of this tell us in the 21st century, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of worldwide chaos? We, like Catherine, were formed and fashioned in the image and likeness of God. Our will, from our very conception, is aligned with God, and we were created as good. Free will is good. We have it within us to counter the evil of this life with the good that is within us. We need only to listen to God to find out how to proceed. Who are those self-seekers in our lives? How can we counter them? Because we really can't avoid them. Are they the people who refuse to follow guidelines for safety and health? Are they the people who follow a party rather than a creed? Are they the people who fill your mind and your heart with fear and uncertainty? And perhaps, are we any of those people? The task before us is to solidify our will with the will of God and to allow Him to guide us and lead us to what we can offer God and to the world. It's not so much about us as it is about what we are willing to offer to help others. The result sometimes is beneficial for us, the giver, but it may not always be the case. It may be several days, years, or perhaps never that we see the results of our actions. But from them will come hope and a stronger reliance on God rather than on ourselves. This was one of the things that Catherine learned and one of the lessons that she wanted us to hear. If we carry the fire of God within us, we can set the world on fire. In isolation, there's a good chance that we will hear the voice of those self-servers and be drawn into the wall of power and greed. But also in our quiet moments, we might hear the voice of God reminding us of the power of our will to choose good, not only for ourselves, but for others, and to use our free will as a pickaxe that will permeate the wall and help others to see the light coming through it. This is the journey of our lifetime, and we learn as we go, just as Catherine did. Catherine used the cross as her compass, knowing that difficulties would come from her actions, but that God would be with her in those difficulties and help her to carry the burdens. For those who are faithful to God's will, good will come as the final result. It may be a struggle to find within us the light that the world needs. This is each person's urgent quest, to be our full self for our sake and for the world's. Catherine of Siena, pray for us.